好，大家好。那接下来下一场是由Team T5 的 Steel 为我们带来的 Sailing the Seven Seas Deep Dive into Polaris Arsenal and Intelligence Insights。那这一场基本上就是在讲一些就是一个这个Polaris 这个 APT 群组他们过去用的 malware 的一些演进的历史，就是蛮 deep dive 的在追踪这个群组。好，那我们就掌声欢迎 Steel。
All right, well, good evening. Welcome to my presentation on Selling the Seven Seas, deep dive into Polaris Arsenal and Intelligence Insights here at HitCon 2024. Thank you for attending this talk. Hope you had a great day for listening to my last talk here today. All right, so let's start with a little introduction of myself. Hello, I'm Still. Some of you may know me online as Azuka. I am a threat intelligence researcher currently employed at Team T5. I have been tracking the group that we'll be talking about today for about as long as I've been working at the company. I'm personally interested in various Windows and .NET related stuff, or really anything that catches my interest. So the following is a rough agenda of what we'll be covering today, ranging from the history of the group to the various malware they have deployed over the last few years. Before we start, let's give a brief history lesson on who Polaris is. All right, Polaris is a Chinese APT group that has been active for well over a decade by now. You may know them better as Mustang Panda, especially on Twitter, or Twill Typhoon for Microsoft, or Preta for the people at Trend Micro. Their main efforts have been mostly focused on East or Southeast Asia for quite a bit now, though they have started recently targeting EU as well. In today's topic, I like to focus on their malware of choice, how they function, as well as how they utilize different malware depending on the target region. Specifically, I'd like to put our focus on their quote-unquote newer malware they have been using for the last 2 years or so, and how they share certain features with each other. Historically, we've known this group for relying heavily on PlugX and the variants they have developed over the last few years, whether it's PlugX Store, MiniPlug, or better known as, I think, Holdor or something like that, PlugDisk, and its predecessor, UDisk Shell. However, the last few years, we started to notice that they started to use something else in parallel to their PlugX family. They have started to develop another set of malware that are used to target very specific countries. Of course, aside from the ones listed above, they have also started using various other tools that they've developed themselves as well. Now, before we go on, you might notice that, hey, hasn't this been talked about a lot already? Why this specific one, especially the TOnePipeShell one, especially for the folks over at Trend Micro. They have covered this malware to death already. So what's the deal? Well, let's just say I feel a little obligated to after my name was dropped in their loader I think it was a few months ago or something. Jokes aside, though, I was going to talk about them anyways, whether or not they name dropped me in their loader. This talk mainly focuses and really compiles all of their arsenal into one single talk, as opposed to like several different blog posts, and focuses on the change that were not yet widely documented. Starting off with their classic sets of malware, PlugX. Polaris is probably one of the few Chinese APT groups that still refuse to let go of PlugX, and made far too many iterations of the infamous malware family. In today's talk, we'll be referring to this cluster of PlugX families as Set A. In our observations over the last few years, we've noticed that these PlugX families tend to be only deployed in certain countries, specifically MiniPlug or Holdor, as it is known in other talks. A variant that is basically tinified and basically with features cut down from the original PlugX, and often OLLVM obfuscated PlugX binaries. They tend to be used in EU countries and several East Asia countries, such as Taiwan. Meanwhile, variants such as PlugX Fast or PlugDisk or PlugX Fast, you might know them as PlugX Store. I think it was in Polaris talk. basically, both of these are observed to be deployed in Southeast Asian countries such as Indonesia and Vietnam the most. Now, next up is today's focus in today's talk, which is set B. This malware includes two primary backdoors that are still being actively utilized, and it's basically the central pillar of today's talk, which are NoFive and TOnePipeShell. We found set B tend to be deployed against Philippines, Myanmar, and Thailand the most. More specifically, Myanmar government and Philippine military, and I believe recently Thailand government as well, being the most prevalent targets. But to really get started, we gotta start from the beginning. Let's start with what we dub TV load, a loader that is used to load Cobalt Strike in the past. Back in 2021 or mid 2021, we noticed a case there was a case against the Taiwanese government. The loader is characterized by the group's tendency to drop its payload within the public libraries folder, as well as its setting up persistence via the shell exec run DLL. I think it was through shell32.dll. The loader eventually loads up a Cobalt Strike stager in the memory. However, later next year, which is early 2022, we start observing a similarly structured loader popping up elsewhere, specifically targeting a case against Philippine governments. It drops a payload in a similar directory and sets up a similar persistence. So the same public libraries folder, the same shell exec run DL method of persistence. But it's still dropping Cobalt Strike stager. In this case, we noticed that the final shellcode payload was not quite what we were expecting. It was something we had never seen before. This is what we dub the NoFive family. The executed shellcode basically is kind of similar to what a Cobalt Strike stager does, where there's a stager component and a beacon component, except the beacon is actually the rat itself. So it downloads and executes the next stage payload in memory. The shellcode downloader, basically, which is the stager, has a similar structure to the payload that it downloads, which we'll get to in a little bit. So it reports back to C2 with a victim ID generated based on volume information and additional information such as computer name and username. Now, finally, the rat itself. The rat itself is also shellcode based, where there's no P structure to be seen in sight. The resulting payload is what we call NoFive. It is a shellcode based backdoor with extremely rudimentary features, such as a very bare bones file management ability, and the ability to change the sleep interval and starting a remote shell. In addition, it is also characterized by some of the stack strings found in the command handler, as shown on the screenshot on the right there. Now, let's talk a little bit more about NoFive itself. So the way NoFive works is that it first creates a structure for importing for configuring the import table, which uses an RR13 plus add algorithm for its API hashing, and then it populates the import table. After the import table has been populated, a large structure is allocated and initialized. I believe in this specific case, as you can see, let me see if I can zoom in here. Yeah, a large struct with the size of 0x184 is initialized here. This structure includes everything from the pointer to the import table we talked about earlier, as well as the stage buffer for the response, and the encryption key, and the C2 information, and the response buffer from the C2. So it's basically an entire, all the information related to the backdoor are allocated within this structure. So in a typical malware scenario, it is usually broken up to several different structures, whereas this one, since everything is in one single structure, it makes everything a lot more difficult to analyze. Now, during the C2 heartbeat, it sends a 16-byte UID that is also created, and basically is transient, is not saved anywhere. And then the entire thing is RC4 encrypted using a hard-coded key. Now, what's perhaps more interesting is that instead of sending the packets as is via standard raw TCP, the data is actually encapsulated in a fake TLS header. So, as you can see from the screenshot on the left there, the first 3 bytes are going to be 0x17, 0x03, and 0x03, which translates to TLS 1.2 application data. So, in typical traffic inspection tools such as Wireshark, it's going to show up as TLS traffic. But in reality, it is really just something disguised as TLS 1.2 traffic. So, in short, we found that in this early iteration of NoFive, it uses RC4 to encrypt its traffic and supports a very basic set of features and shares a large structure that is used amongst various functions, as well as having a stager beacon design. The majority of these key features are the foundations of NoFive and are used across many of its future iterations as well, which we'll get to in the later half of the presentation. Now, the big one, TOnePipeShell. In around the same time, or rather, I think it was like a year after NoFive was discovered, around mid-2022, we spotted a case against Myanmar government where a RR file is shown in the slide here. So it has a launcher, a DLL, and another sets of PEs that are disguised as fake document files. So these 2 files are actually copied and moved to the public documents folder. The loader drops the PEs I just talked about and decodes and executes the payload as shellcode with an embedded 32-byte XOR key, which then uses another embedded key to decode the final payload. Now, this malware is not quite what we're expecting either, since it is very differently structured from NoFive. It still uses the same RR13 plus add as its hashing algorithm, and it still gets a get product address and load library first. But the populated C2 configuration structure is something we hadn't seen before in NoFive, and appears to be intended to support up to 10 C2s in the configuration. Not only that, the feature set and command handlers are different as well. So compare the command codes to NoFive. Features a different set of stack string as well to go along with the command handler. As you can see, if I can zoom in here, yeah, these stack strings look completely different from the previous one. With the primary interest of ours being the line create TOnePipeShell class error. This is where we named the malware from, and several other outlets and vendors also named their malware based on this string as well. This version of the RAT supports features such as remote shell, process execution, and basic file management. Now, it is worth noting that TOnePipeShell payloads we've observed throughout the years, that not all of them support all of these features I just mentioned, the process management, the file upload, the remote shell. All of them support remote shell, except that smaller features such as file management appears to be optional, where I guess it is toggled at build stage or something, where these features may not be actually present in the code itself. In this first version of TOnePipeShell, we noticed that instead of using just RC4, this early iteration also uses an XOR key whose value range from 0x0 to 0x1f for the initial C2 check-in. After that, though, the traffic is still being encrypted using RC4. Now, as you can see from all of that, we can summarize the features as the chart on the left. As you can see, the structures and feature sets are largely identical to NoFive with a few key differences. You might think that NoFive is just an iteration, or rather, TOnePipeShell is just an iteration of NoFive. However, there are several major distinctions, being that the stack strings I mentioned earlier, as well as some of the feature sets. And there are some minor tweaks as well between this and NoFive. And what's most important is that we hadn't seen any TOnePipeShell that is being delivered in the stager beacon form. And for most of the TOnePipeShell instances we've seen, all of them exist as a RAT itself, and is delivered as the backdoor itself. There is no downloader to it all. All right, to switch gears up a little bit, we saw something completely different again in mid-2023. This is what we dub QReverse. As you can see from the chart here, the attack used a RAR file that uses a launcher loader combination that the group was previously known to use, specifically the Cisco ones shown here. It ends up loading the shellcode by decoding the webx.txt next to it and ends up executing something like this. Now, the loader uses a special multi-layered XOR algorithm to decode its payload via a key embedded within the loader, which results in another set of shellcode. And the shellcode then uses the stack string shown on the screen, the one that starts with 135, as the XOR key for the second stage payload, resulting in the actual RAT itself. Now, thankfully, this one is fairly easy to look through because all of the PE structures are still here. And as we can see that there are some very helpful strings in here, we can see that there are quite a few unique identifiers. Not only has the payload been helpfully timestamped within the directory name, we can also see various key names such as Talos and QReverse, with QReverse being the most prominent class name. Now, what's perhaps the most interesting is that similar to the multi-layer XOR we mentioned earlier for the loader part, there's also another similar structured XOR encoding algorithm used to decode its traffic configuration. Now, compared to the previous two RATs we've looked at, this one is basically fully stacked. It supports quite a few features, with supported commands being up to like retrieval of file system information, starting a remote shell, managing files, even setting a different C2 and screenshotting and creating a new process. There are up to 25 different command codes in this specific instance we looked at. That is quite a stark contrast compared to the previous two RATs we looked at. Now, let's do a quick summary of this one. We can see that compared to the other two RATs we've seen, this one features far more features and uses a special multi-layered XOR encoding scheme to encode and decode the traffic and the config. We are currently unsure whether QReverse is exclusive to the group, as we had seen QReverse being used in other operations that use vastly different TTPs as well, and launcher loader combinations that we hadn't seen before. Now, of course, that's not to say that this may not be from the same developer or from the same group. It's just we don't have enough concrete information to back that up yet. Now, next up is what we call U2 Disk Watch. This one is not necessarily new. It was first reported by Sophos back in late 2022. It is a USB infection module responsible for installing the nearby files next to it. So, for example, if you put the DLL and put other files next to it, it's going to copy everything right next to it to install onto the victim machine. The module is characterized by the little PDB string, as you can see here, where in later samples, we actually continue to see the same PDB strings from the one in the report and from the samples we found. The module, however, we started to notice that in late 2023, we spotted that there was a RF file that contained a newer version of U2 Disk Watch, and we noticed that it included NoFive in there as well. So in this specific version, or rather a newer version, instead of keeping the files in the single USB.ini file as we had previously seen, the ini file is instead replaced by a $.ini file, which contains the files that need to be installed, the file names themselves. And within these sets of files, we saw TV load and NoFive. Now, speaking of spreading via USB, another variant cropped up that we had dubbed T1 disk. We started seeing this variant crop up around the same time as well in late 2023, but this one is a lot more different from the previous USB spreader we saw. The previous USB spreader we saw basically installed anything that you gave it, But in this one, it basically contains both the spreader component and the payload it wants to install within like the same package. Not only that, we also saw that all of these Ps that are included, they are compiled specifically in debug mode. As in, if you've ever opened up a binary that's built with MSVC, and if you open it in IDA, you're going to see a whole lot of unoptimized and basically unrelated MSVC functions and instructions, which makes reverse engineering a lot more annoying as well. Let's start from the installer component first. So in this specific sample set that we saw, the installer requires an argument to launch. And I believe this has started to become a case for this group recently as well, where instead of just executing as is, it's going to require an additional argument for it to launch properly. This is usually done to evade sandbox detections. It also clears various directories that are often used by the same group. So as you can see from here, it's going to clean up the libraries folder, the Avast antivirus folder, Adobe desktop folder, NeuroEdit, WaveEdit. Basically, if you have seen this group before, you'll know that they love these directories, especially back in the PlugX days. Once the installer has been installed, the relevant file names are hard-coded, and the infection module is launched in the background along with the backdoor. The infection module basically constantly loops through all of the discover removable drives, where it's basically a while loop that keeps running. Once the drive has been spotted, it's gonna move everything within the USB drive to a hidden directory that cannot be displayed. It is specifically, as you can see, is moved to this undisplayable Unicode character. And the various disk modules are written to the drive as well, along with a fake USB disk folder at the root of the infected drive. Now, in early 2023, we spotted a new revision where the files are now combined into 3 main files instead of multiple sets of files, whereas before it was like 3 different sets of files. Now it's just 3 files themselves. The main launcher still requires various arguments to launch, with the different arguments starting different modules, with -i being the installation module, with -w being both the watchdog and the backdoor module. Instead of copying the launcher as is, the various files are now renamed as fake documents instead. So as you can see from the little screenshot I have here, it's basically 7 different characters, 7 random characters, along with the extension name .log, .txt, and .pdf. Whereas before it was simply just .exe, .dll. Another thing is that the watchdog module is now combined with the backdoor. Previously, it was 2 different files. Now it's in the same file, where one side of the P is the watchdog, and the other side is the actual payload itself, which is TOnePipeShell. Now, with all that out of the way, I want to talk about the changes over the last few years. We noticed that there are many variants that were developed over the last few years. NoFive itself hasn't really received too many changes over the last few years. However, it is still being actively used. TOnePipeShell, on the other hand, has had numerous changes over the last few years, with new version being spotted almost every few months. Let's start with NoFive. NoFive is relatively simple, as it only had 2 extra versions. So this is what we call Type 2. This was first discovered in late 2022, which is about a year after its initial debut, with the major change being moving over to HTTP, as well as still using the same RC4 encryption. Now, later in Type 3, which is discovered in mid-2023, once again about a year later, we saw the traffic encoding style has been changed to the 4-layer XOR encoding scheme that we saw in QReverse. And this version still uses HTTP as well. What is the most interesting is that, so this Type 3 actually came out in 2023. However, they only kept using it until like the end of 2023. Once 2024 rolled around, they started to go back to Type 1 now for the various attacks we've observed over the last few months. Now, TOnePipeShell. TOnePipeShell is the one that got the most revisions over the last few years. So TOnePipeShell, the earliest iterations we can saw right after original one was, in fact, right after original one. As in, like, it was discovered almost on the same day as the Type 1 was discovered. This variant directly corresponds to Trend Micro's Type B variant. This version has a reduced number of C2 slots, but still looks roughly the same, and still uses TCP for communication, and with an XOR key size of 0x20. Next up is Type 3. We started seeing TOnePipeShell finally writing the aforementioned victim GUID into a persistent file, as in, like, the GUID doesn't change after the executable has been restarted. In this case, a 4-byte GUID is written to an IONF file based on the data that was retrieved from get volume information. Otherwise, the vast majority of the RAT was mostly unchanged. It was still using TCP, it was still using the 0x20 size XOR key. Now, next up, 2020, the one we spotted in mid-2023. Type 4 is where the design is a lot more stabilized, where if you compare this specific one to the modern TOnePipeShell, it's actually looks roughly the same. This directly corresponds to Trend Micro's Type D. We started seeing the RNG mechanism and the C2 structure being a lot more defined in the code this time. And instead of using a 4-byte GUID, is now a 16-byte one written to this web.facebook.config file. And the XOR key has ballooned up to 0x200 instead of 0x20. Next up, Type 5 and Type 5.5. These two threw a curveball at us initially. The code structure is much cleaner and contains stack strings and PDB strings that refer to the payload as bcontrol, BECTRL, and now includes a fake HTTP header as well. This version also includes a version number that is lowercase x 1.0. We initially thought this was a completely new RAT, but based on the behaviors, we've determined that this was likely a variant of TOnePipeShell, as opposed to a completely new RAT. Our speculation is that bcontrol is basically just a part of a code name for the client version of the RAT. Otherwise, it still uses the 0x20 size XOR key, and this one specifically for Type 5 is in the shellcode form instead of PE. Now for Type 5.5, this was around late 2023. This one is slightly different from the previous one I mentioned, except the instead of using shellcode, it is now PE, and it now returns a version number that is uppercase v1.0 instead of lowercase x 1.0. The default, the encoding mechanism is also slightly changed from the default XOR behavior to the one we found in QReverse. Now, Type 6 is where we started seeing the identifiers that are being placed under preferences and description.ini. It is rarely changed, starting from this version, where basically from this version onwards, they're usually stored in either of these files. Interestingly, this version also contains a few odds and ends, such as stack strings that are called, there was one that's called fatal error LNK, and the other being hello world. This wasn't a one-off either. We actually saw this in like dozens of samples. And starting from this version, the API hashing behavior also changed from the previous RR13 plus add to now an I multiply 13, 13, 13, 13 instead. Now, Type 6 has shrunken back a little bit on the size, is now back to 0x100 for the XOR key size. Now, there's a slightly newer version of Type 6 that was found as part of the T1 disk discovery. This one was a lot more difficult to look through, as previously discussed, that T1 disk uses a debug build, and it makes reverse engineering a lot more annoying to do. This one writes to a software distribution.db instead of an IONF file for the GUID. And the handshake format is also slightly different, but at least it still uses the same 0x100 sized XOR key. Now, lastly, TOnePipeShell Type 7. This one was literally spotted like a month before this talk. This version changed the XOR key size to a very strange 0xE9 instead of standard number like integer 32 or 0x20. Previously, the handshake during the initial C2 check-in, it only sent GUID. Starting from this version, it now includes the computer name as well, as opposed to sending the computer name and username after the initial handshake. So now with all that out of the way, I think it's time to move on to the actual summary. Per usual for Polaris, we observed a lot of Easter egg strings across TV low binaries over the last few years. This is not necessarily new. If you're familiar with this group, you know that they love putting Easter egg strings in their loaders. I think it was as far as back as like late 2010s. It is clear that the group is aware of the research efforts that we have and a lot of other researchers have put in detecting their stuff. Now, about the challenges we faced during the investigation. The structures in both NoFive and TOnePipeShell, while they're relatively clear, one of the biggest problems we faced reverse engineering both of these is that the large structure that is shared within the rats is often very time consuming just to figure out what exactly changed, since the offset changes all the time between versions. And sometimes not even all the properties or members are the same throughout different versions. And that is even with a lot of help from other IDA plugins for reconstructing the type, especially given most of these plugins only reconstruct the type based on the currently selected pseudocode, where a lot of times these structures are actually larger or smaller than the one they guessed, where it's basically it takes like a few hours just to try to figure out what exactly is what and at what offset and what type, etc., etc. Next up is the use of debug builds. Whilst having debug builds sometimes helps with identifying the various names and variables, so in some cases, in the debug binaries, we're actually able to find the various variables they named, for example, references to various libraries and shellcode, etc., etc. The problem is the trade-off is the number of instructions and functions balloon up when you compile it as a debug build. Now, we noticed the biggest finding of all of this is that we noticed that they really love to stick to this large share structure thing across different families, where almost all of them share the same code template with the same 0x17, 0x03, the TLS packaging, the large structure, etc., etc. The majority of them also share the similar API hashing encoding algorithm as well. Now, next up is that the group is clearly back to doing their old stuff again. They, back in, I believe it was late 2010s, early 2020s, they love to do campaigns where they abuse USB removable device as part of their infection chain. They're back to doing the same thing again after just a few years. We also noticed that starting from recent years, Polaris has also started to pick up on previously unseen launcher loader combinations. Back in the PlugX days, Polaris would usually rotate between like a dozen combos, and like they rarely change them over a few years. However, starting from recent operations, they have gotten pretty good at deploying launchers that weren't well documented or at all. Rarely do incidents or samples use the same launcher as each other. All right, now next up, we also noticed that they start to tamper with the PDB path as well. We are unsure why that is the case, since PDB paths, if anyone that's ever written a C++ application and with MSVC, you would know that you can override the PDB path with PDB alt path during the linker stage. It looks like they're just manually going into the PDB path part and just start typing random stuff instead. We're not really sure why they're doing this. Then again, they're the type of people that put a lot of strange strings in their loaders. So, what's even stranger is that they sometimes forget to do that as well. They simply just forget to change the PDB or just forgot to turn off PDB generation. Thanks to this, we've also found various project names that are involved, with the most common ones being YK followed by a 4-digit number, with YK likely standing for 远控, which is remote control. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture. We can see that Polaris is still ever evolving, with their primary backdoor being TOnePipeShell. TOnePipeShell has been spotted basically weekly at this rate. They keep making changes as well, likely to trying to evade detection. And we also conclude that the majority of our tool sets are relatively minimal, with the one exception being QReverse. And that in the sense that the rat themselves don't really pack a whole lot of features, whereas the ones we talked about were mostly limited to just remote shell capabilities. Now, from our research, we also saw a clear divide between the target country and malware types used. With Philippines, Myanmar, Thailand being most susceptible to TOnePipeShell and NoFive family, whilst Vietnam, Indonesia, Mongolia, EU, Taiwan still being targeted with mostly plugx related families. Though that is not to say that these malware are exclusive to the regions I just talked about. It's just that they are the most prominent in these areas. We also continue to, we've also noticed that they continue to target sensitive industries such as government and military-related agencies. Lastly, let's talk conclusions. So, in today's talk, we went through the overall artillery that Polaris uses. We can see that the group has started to expand beyond just plugx and start to make their own iterations of malware families starting from 2022. These malware cleverly disguise themselves with fake TLS traffic, and the developers are constantly making changes to evade detections. They've also started to abuse previously undocumented legitimate launchers. However, mixed in with these TTPs are still old tricks, such as how they're still using removable drives for targeting air-gapped devices, using more or less the same methods. Now let's talk mitigations, because of course I gotta include a slide about mitigations. Beware of phishing emails. This is still their most usual way of entering somewhere. There's still their primary point of entry, where they send phishing email and try to get you to click on something. And also double check before clicking on anything in a removable drive. Once a USB drive has been loaded into Windows, if you see a file or folder, quote unquote folder, that's not quite what you're expecting, especially if it's somehow with an extension of exe, don't click on it. Yeah, only click on things if you are sure that the files that are in there are the ones that you're familiar with, like the files the documents that you last put into the remove drive. All right, and that's it for my talk.
好，那我们谢谢 Steve 精彩的演讲。那大家有什么问题想要问的吗？I just want to check. You accept questions in Mandarin? 可以用中文问，也可以。有人有问题吗？嗨。
讲者刚刚有列出一些被滥用的一些有签章的执行档嘛，那一页不知道可不可以公开一下？
那些全部都会在 slides 里面，就是应该事后会在 HitCon 的网站上公布。
OK， 好，谢谢。
那还有人有问题吗？Any questions？
不过他们是用很多啦，就是他们现在一直都在变，所以就算有那个列表，它应该不止那一堆。嗨。
题外我来问一下，就是应该有贴一页，就是有什么裴洛西那些有趣的自传。那我知道前几个月你的名字也被他们利用，就是你对于这个有什么想法吗？
没什么想法，就有一天醒来，然后就上班时间，然后就我同事敲了我一下，说你被盯上了哦。 就我也没有什么想法，就好哦。
好，那大家还有人有问题吗？没有的话，那我来问一个好了。那其实我看他们整个在技术方面的话，就是说在最近5年内，还有在用像 RC4 嘛，然后他们故意开 debug，就是说我不知道他们是不是故意的。那还有一些就是说，或他们用 XOR 之类这么粗暴的密码学的方式。那对于他们这种行为，你是觉得他们单纯就只是不会，还是他们是故意想要？
我是觉得他们过去几年都是在耍烂的，就是他们一直都是东西做的很简陋的 group 这样子，只是他们就一直打，所以才会那个名声这么高。
所以感觉这样的一个群组，其实他们不是说技术特别强，而是说他们就是滥竽充数，就是乱箭乱射，
对，
射到一个是一个。所以大家就是如果在防 Blue Team 的，可能遇到他们就是要防一些比较老梗的东西就好，不用太担心。
他们真的很少用什么太创新的技术，他们就连那个，我觉得之前就那个连那个 PlugX 做 OLVM 这回事，我觉得他们也纯粹只是想要挡，就是稍微把一些初级一点的那个 reverse engineer 搞垮而已。但是我觉得他们根本就没有想要整个把 PlugX 做得很强一样的感觉，就是纯粹是你就像把它想用 VMP 打爆，好就这样解决这样的感觉。
对于这样的一个 APT 群组来说的话，如果我们要防范它的话，感觉就是传统的 endpoint detection 有做好，然后有在确认他们训练没有人员不会乱点phishing， 然后 policy 设好，确保这些不太容易被执行，然后还有随身碟相关 policy 要设定好，这样的感觉就相对足够，这样就是他们感觉有点像就是抓最后一个这样，就是
应该说他们就是非常传统的 APT 族群啊，就是有点像2010年初一直没有在更新的感觉。
OK， 好，那看大家还有没有问题？那我们这场就到这边，那我们再次用掌声谢谢 Steve。